Ladies and gentlemen, revenge doesn't begin with hatred, it begins with love. The kind of love that is ripped apart so violently that the heart has only one language left: vengeance. This is not just a story of revenge. It's the story of a son's promise carved in blood, sealed in silence, and destined to be fulfilled. He was only a boy when he saw his father fall, not to a stranger, but to the very people who once sat at their family table, laughing and sharing bread. That night shattered something sacred inside him. The sound of betrayal was louder than the gunshot, more piercing than the scream that followed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father reaching out, and every time he opened them, he remembered that no one had reached back. He was too young to understand the politics, the greed, the lies, but old enough to understand one truth: the people he trusted had drawn the blade. Years passed, but time did not heal, it only sharpened the pain. The boy grew into a man, yet the wound in his heart stayed raw, as if the blood still hadn't dried. He tried to bury the memories under years of silence, pretending that forgiveness could cleanse him. But forgiveness is a language the broken cannot speak. Every act of kindness he saw felt like mockery, every laughter like an echo of those who once betrayed his father. He carried that memory like a curse, a scar that burned every time he tried to live like everyone else. One night he returned to the old house, now abandoned and cold. Dust covered everything except the spot where his father fell. It was there that he knelt, pressing his hand to the earth, and whispered the words that would define his destiny. He vowed that the blood spilled that night would not fade into history. He swore to repay betrayal with justice, deceit with fire, and cowardice with truth. That moment was not rage, it was rebirth. The boy who once trembled became a man forged in vengeance. From that day he disappeared from the world's eyes. He moved in shadows, learning, waiting, and preparing. Each year that passed, he grew colder, quieter, more focused. He studied his enemies, understanding their weaknesses, their fears, their desires. The same people who once called him the lost son would one day know his name again, but this time, it would be whispered in fear. Patience became his weapon, silence his ally. He was not chasing death, he was shaping it. But vengeance has a price, and the closer he came to fulfilling his oath, the more he realized that revenge does not end pain, it only transfers it. Each victory felt hollow, each act of justice, heavier. Yet he could not stop, not after promising the grave he'd stand over his father's killers. When the last one fell, he felt no triumph, no joy, only emptiness. Still, he looked to the sky and whispered, "Father, it's done." For in keeping his vow, he had lost everything else: peace, love, even himself. But he didn't care. He had kept the oath, and that, in his heart, was all that mattered. Years later, when the dust of time had settled but the ache remained, he found himself standing once more on the land that had taken everything from him. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rain and old memories. The soil beneath his feet still seemed to carry the echo of his father's fall, as if the earth itself refused to forget. He had spent years pretending to move on, wearing a mask of peace while his heart rotted beneath it. But standing there, surrounded by silence, he felt the old fire flicker again, a reminder that some ghosts do not rest until they are avenged. He knelt before the grave, the wind whispering through the trees like the breath of the dead. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of everything he had carried alone. There were no flowers, no prayers, only the cold stone and the memory of a man who had once been his entire world. He whispered his father's name, and for a moment it felt as if time stopped. In that silence he could almost hear his father's voice urging him to let go, but the son could not. Forgiveness was a luxury the betrayed could never afford. With a steady voice he spoke to the night, his words carving through the air like a blade. He promised that the blood spilled that day would not go unanswered, that every man responsible would one day taste the same despair they had dealt. It wasn't a cry for justice, it was an oath born of pain, a declaration of war against fate itself. He knew what it would cost him: peace, mercy, maybe even his soul. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The dead demanded a debt to be paid, and he would be the one to collect it. As the moonlight fell across the grave, he pressed his hand against the cold earth, sealing his vow in silence. The boy who once cried for help was gone. In his place stood a man molded by loss and sharpened by rage. The night became his witness, the stars his judges. What began as grief had now transformed into purpose, and that purpose would consume everything in its path. When he finally stood up, the world seemed different. The air felt colder, the darkness heavier. But for the first time in years, he felt clarity, a cruel, burning kind of peace. He walked away without looking back, leaving behind the innocence that once defined him. That night, a son died beside his father's grave, and in his place rose something far more dangerous, a man bound by blood, driven by vengeance, and destined to fulfill his final oath. Revenge is not something that screams. It whispers. It hides in quiet corners of the mind and waits. That was how he lived, not in fury, but in focus. He learned to wear calm like armor, to speak softly while his heart plotted storms. Rage, he discovered, burns fast and blind, but patience cuts deeper. So he trained his anger into silence, his grief into precision. Every day he smiled, every day he played the fool, but deep down he was sharpening his soul like a blade. He began to study those who had betrayed his father, not as enemies, but as prey. He watched their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. He learned where they went when they thought no one was watching, what they feared when they thought they were alone. To them, he was invisible, a face from the past, harmless, forgettable. But to him, they were already ghosts walking on borrowed time. Every laugh they shared was one heartbeat closer to their reckoning. He moved through their world like smoke, unseen yet everywhere. In meetings, he stood in the background. In conversations, he listened more than he spoke. He heard things others ignored, a careless remark, a half-truth, a whispered confession. Every word became a clue, every secret a weapon. They believed he had forgotten. That time had softened his heart, but they were wrong. Behind his calm eyes was a storm gathering force, waiting for the right moment to strike. He didn't act out of impulse. He waited for precision, for the day when each piece would fall into place. It wasn't about killing, not yet. It was about breaking them slowly, letting fear rot their confidence from within. He wanted them to feel what his father felt, the helplessness, the betrayal, the cold realization that their time had come. One by one, he turned their lives into mirrors of their own cruelty, until they began to sense that something or someone was closing in. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The man they had ignored, the boy they had left to suffer, was now the shadow that haunted their every step. He became what they feared most, not death, but judgment. He didn't need an army, nor forgiveness. He only needed his purpose. And when his eyes finally met theirs, they didn't see rage. They saw destiny, cold, unrelenting, and written in the bloodline they had tried to erase. Every act of vengeance carried a piece of his soul with it. The first time he struck back, he felt a strange silence inside. Not satisfaction, not peace, just emptiness. He had expected to feel whole again, to feel his father's spirit ease the ache in his chest. But instead he felt heavier. Each name he crossed off his list left a weight that grew rather than lifted. He began to understand that vengeance was not a path one walked toward redemption, but a spiral that dragged him deeper into the same darkness he once hated. He tried to justify it, telling himself that what he was doing was justice, not cruelty. But in the mirror, he no longer saw the son who swore to defend his father's honor. He saw the same coldness, the same hunger for control that once lived in the eyes of those he hunted. At night, when the world went still, he would hear his father's voice, not proud, not approving, but distant, as if even the dead could not stand too close to what he had become. Yet he couldn't stop. The promise had become his prison, and breaking it would mean betraying the only thing that gave his life meaning. He started losing parts of himself that had nothing to do with the fight. Friends drifted away, unable to understand the silence in him, the obsession that ruled every breath. Love became impossible. Trust became weakness. He could no longer tell if he was fighting for justice or if he was simply running from the pain of being powerless. Every time he looked at his hands, he saw more blood than before, and it no longer mattered whose it was. He was becoming what he once swore to destroy. Still, something inside him refused to let go. He told himself it was duty, that the debt wasn't yet paid. But in truth, it was fear. Fear of what would be left once the revenge was over. If he stopped, he'd have to face the truth, that vengeance had replaced his purpose, and without it, he was nothing but a man haunted by loss. So he kept going, chasing ghosts through the ashes of his own soul, destroying others to keep himself from falling apart. When the last of them fell, he didn't feel victory, he felt silence, a silence so deep it felt like the world itself had turned away. There were no cheers, no closure, no peace. Only the bitter realization that revenge doesn't end the pain. It merely passes it on, leaving the avenger as the final victim. Standing over the final grave, he whispered, "Father, it's done." But even then, he knew the truth. It wasn't his father's voice that answered, it was his own. Breaking under the weight of everything vengeance had cost him, when the final name was gone, when the last breath of his enemies faded into the night, the world fell utterly still. He stood among the wreckage of everything he had destroyed, his hands trembling, his clothes soaked in the blood of a legacy that had devoured itself. The silence was deafening. No cries, no resistance, no more reasons to fight. For years, his heart had been driven by a single purpose, and now that it was complete, all that remained was the hollow echo of victory. The vengeance that once burned like fire inside him now felt cold, lifeless. He had become the last witness of his own destruction. The dawn crept across the horizon, pale and indifferent, as if the sun refused to recognize the man standing beneath it. He looked at his reflection in the blade that had served him so faithfully, but he no longer recognized the face staring back. His eyes, once filled with fury and grief, were empty, drained of everything human. He realized then that vengeance had taken not only his enemies but also the man he used to be. The son who once swore to defend his father's name had vanished long ago, replaced by something darker, something that lived only for retribution. He thought about his father, about the man whose honor he had sworn to protect. Would his father have wanted this? Would he have looked upon his son with pride or sorrow? The thought pierced deeper than any blade could. He understood, at last, that vengeance had not restored his father's legacy. It had buried it beneath more violence, more lies, more blood. The cycle had not ended, it had simply shifted, with him now standing on the same cursed ground his enemies once occupied. The realization struck him like a final punishment. Revenge doesn't heal the wound, it becomes the wound. Kneeling to the ground, he whispered the words he had carried in silence for so long. "Father, it's done." His voice broke as he spoke the final truth. "Forgive me for becoming what I hated to honor what I loved." The tears that followed were not for his enemies, but for himself. For the boy who once believed justice could be found through pain. He had walked through darkness thinking he could control it, but now he knew darkness always takes more than it gives. It consumes everything, even love. As the first light touched his face, he felt the weight of his choices settle like dust on the ruins around him. There was no redemption waiting, no peace earned, only the cold comfort of a promise fulfilled. He closed his eyes, letting the wind carry away the last of his anger, the last of his name. In the end, he had kept his oath, but it had cost him everything. The world would remember him as a monster or a martyr, but he no longer cared. For him, it was never about being remembered, it was about keeping a promise. And that promise, written in blood, was finally complete. They say blood calls to blood, and when it does, no force on earth can silence it. This was not justice. This was legacy. This was the son's final oath.